Good evening, colleagues. A very warm welcome to Chelsea College of Art. My name's David Crowe and I have the privilege to be the head of college here at Chelsea. I'm delighted that we're able to host this conference along with our partners, the Tate Gallery, Middlesex University, the Institute of International Visual Arts, and of course thanks to our funders, the HRC. It really is a privilege for us that we create a platform tonight for this debate around this subject, and that our staff team and our students are engaged in a constant re-evaluation of artists of the recent past. It seems to me particularly relevant that we explore global identity through the visual arts at this moment, against the backdrop of real political flux in the UK. The research that underpins Black Artists and Modernism can help to bring, I think, fresh perspectives to a discussion that desperately needs more diverse range of voices. As a college, it's key, I think, to our success that our research helps us to drive the academic direction of our teaching. The learning we do in this conference, as a group of staff, will be used to develop our curriculum, engage the next generation of art and design professionals in the aesthetic, social, political, and economic challenges of tomorrow. It will be used to refresh the discussion in the studios around us in the college, and it will inform student project work across a whole range of disciplines. Black Artists and Modernism will impact on the way we consider what we teach our students about black artists. It will help us reconsider their place in history and their influence in current art and design practice. The proximity of Chelsea College to the Tate actually enables us to carry out these debates in really close quarters to developments that are happening in our national museums, major cultural institutions, and helps us to connect our students to a much wider professional world. So thank you to all of you for coming along to help us achieve this. So now I'd just like to hand over to Professor Sonia Boyce, who will introduce our very special guest speaker this evening, Kobena Mercer from Yale University. Sonia.
Okay, Kobena, who I've known for a very, very long time. It just gives me enormous pleasure, actually, to welcome you here. Kobena is a professor of History of Art and African American Studies since 2011 at Yale University. But of course, many of us will know a lot of the work that he's done here in terms of writing, thinking, being an activist, a cultural activist since the 1980s. You know, he was the author of the book Welcome to the Jungle, which was a selection of his essays that were really groundbreaking. And you know, I can't stress enough how much we miss him in terms of his presence here in the UK, because he's really forged a way of thinking and an approach that is absolutely necessary. His recent book Travel and See, which is published this year, on black diaspora practices since the 1980s I think it's going to be launched tomorrow evening. And it's a fantastic read, and it actually gets to quite a lot of the heart of what the team, the Black Artists and Modernism research team, we're all here. Hopefully everybody will have introduced themselves to all of our colleagues who've agreed to join us. It's been really insightful in terms of trying to think through how have we missed certain things? You know, how have we missed actually talking about the work itself? How have we missed contextualizing the work in it, not only from the perspective of now, but in its historical arc? You know, one of the things that really was at the heart of, was the starting point actually of the Black Artists and Modernism Research Project was Kobena's intervention at the Shades of Black conference that happened in 2001 at Duke University, and I'm really pleased that we have Rick Powell and C.T. Powell, C.T. Woods Powell here from Duke who've joined us. You know, and what Kobena had to say to us, and it caused a huge storm within the conference, was we're happy to talk about the kind of cultural identity, which we're happy to talk about institutional politics, but somehow the work itself gets eclipsed. How are we not talking about the work? Now, in a way, it's quite obvious, but it takes someone with vision to say that. And I'm so, so, so pleased that he's agreed, because he was the starting point of the Black Artists and Modernism project, to come and speak to us tonight. Thank you so much, Kobe.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm honoured to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. Honoured to be invited to present this evening's keynote, and I'd like to express my thanks to Sonia, to David, Susan, and the entire team that's organised it so smoothly. This is an initiative of far-reaching ambition, and so I'm very proud to be part of it, and I'm also looking forward very much to the conversations that will be taking place tomorrow and the day after. So when Frank Bowling arrived in New York in late 1966, he was not just making a journey from figurative painting to abstraction, he was also charting a late colonial voyage into the late modern epicenter of the international art world. Where New York stole the idea of modern art in the post-war era, it's crucial to be clear at the outset that unlike Paris, Berlin, Zurich or Moscow, London had never been the centre for the production of modernist art. In 1933, Leonard and Virginia Woolf published C.L.R. James's The Case for West Indian Self-Government, but on the whole, Bloomsbury modernism was far more at home on the East Sussex coast at Charleston than in the gritty streets between Euston and Charing Cross. Modernism was art's answering response to the questions and crises, the opportunities and possibilities thrown open by modernity, which is to say that unlike France, Germany, Italy or Spain, in Britain it was always a case of modernity hesitant. Why modernize your infrastructure when the empire provides for all your needs? So rather than modernism, it was the traditionalism of British culture, and especially British education, that led Bowling to his schooling in London, age 15 in 1950, and which brought Anwar Shemzar from Lahore in Pakistan to Slade School of Fine Art in 1956. The world-crossing journeys by which London was Rashid Areen's destination in 1964, the place that Mitra Tabrizian came to on leaving Iran in 1978, and where Gavin Janches chose to settle in 1982, having resided in Hamburg after he left Cape Town, all turned not on which was the most modern metropolis, but on geopolitical tracks historically laid down by the vast sprawl of empire. So in this lecture, we'll look across the huge transformation that took place from the late colonial movement of the 50s and early 1960s through the decolonial context of the 1970s to the emergent Black British art practices, which, from the 1980s onward, introduced a diasporic dimension to contemporary art and intellectual life. Not much will be said about the two most recent decades, not because there's little to say, but because the focus on the super contemporary is precisely the reason why presentism is the name of a problem. Wishfully thinking of the now as a redemptive moment that will make good all that was omitted and injured in the bad old days back then, presentism actually gets in the way of our ability to historicize. The understandable impulse to celebrate the massive changes that have transformed late colonial monoculture into post-colonial multiculture all too often have the unintended effect of keeping art history's same old stories thoroughly intact. What's worse, presentism prevents us from seeing that critical art is never a passive reflector of historical change, but is itself an active agent in the emergence of the new, which was what modernism's underlying impetus was all about to begin with. So taking as my starting point the view that the contemporary emerges from the critique of the institutionalization of modernism that develops with the rise of modern art museums after 1945, I argue that we first need to attend to what was at stake in the universalist language of modernist internationalism that Bowling and Schemser, amongst others, upheld in their chosen medium of abstract painting. Asking what carried over and what was displaced in the strategies whereby Arene's path through minimalism, conceptualism, and performance brought dissatisfaction with high formalism into a frictional dialogue with anti-racist and anti-imperialist alliances. The key question for the third turn in my story, what does the blackness of black Britishness stand for as a signifier, leads me to suggest that collage-based cut and mix provided the resourceful means by which the aesthetics of hybridity articulated counter-narratives to neoliberal globalization. So I need to stress that this is not a progress narrative that I've come to tell. Instead of telling it forward, as if to narrate a past whose problem spaces are now closed and finalized, what we need, I argue, is a genealogy of modernism in all its conjunctural interactions with modernity, the whole kit and caboodle, so as to understand that art enters history not in the form of a list or a canon, but through a process of becoming that's always ongoing, that's always in the making. Who are you? Where'd you come from? And when are you going back? The question of identity arises in the migrant experience in the form of a self-questioning. Where do I belong? Yet it actually originates from an environment in which that which is different or foreign mostly meets with ambiguous responses. With her Vidal Sassoon bob and her Corrège-like dress, complete with op art target, where you'd expect to see a Mary Quant Daisy, the foreground figure in CoverGirl of 1964 belongs to a place and time that's utterly distinct from the colonial building rendered in the dark green image silkscreened in the background, which was the Bowling family home. Located inland on the Essequibo River near the 17th century Dutch settlement of Kijk Overal, which means to see overall, the town of Bartica, where the artist's parents ran Bowling Variety Store, was only the starting point for the Atlantic journeys whereby one world citizen established his multiple attachments to different places of belonging. Identity was never Frank Bowling's subject matter, and biographical reductionism has been the kiss of death for black Atlantic artists whose formal and stylistic choices get subsumed into their life story. But our ability to recognize the topology of multiple belonging evoked by the silk-screened photograph that also recurs in such paintings as Mother's House with Beware of the Dog of 1966, Bartica Born 2 of 1969, and Where is Lucienne of 1971, had to wait until art history belatedly caught up with late 20th century diaspora theory. This is Where is Lucienne of 1971. Rethinking diaspora not as the tragic loss of organic roots, but as a polycentric network of cross-cultural roots that give black cultures their transnational character, Paul Gilroy's 1993 book, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, built on methods offering a relational alternative to our conventional habit of thinking of identities as self-sufficient and self-contained. A Yorkshireman in California does not a Californian become. That's what an essentialist would think on the basis of the view that your origin determines who and what you really are, and that staying true to your roots results in an authentic self that is fundamentally unchanged and unchanging, whatever environment one happens to pass through. When Caribbean retirees returning to their islands find themselves perceived as coming from foreign, they too meet up with the same attitude that when it comes to a place called home, you can only have one. But as the silkscreen persists, you may be able to make it out there in the background, as the silkscreen persists like a retinal afterimage, when Bowling moves into colour-filled painting in works such as Where is Lucienne, the paradox we face in an artist who clearly did not perceive abstraction and figuration to be mutually exclusive, is that even as his map paintings use colour to bring line and shape to the threshold of dissolution, The essays that Bowling contributed to Arts magazine from 1969 to 1971 reveal his allegiance to the language of formalist universalism, in which the comings and goings of an artist's social background are really irrelevant to the aesthetic qualities of autonomous artworks whose meaning is held to be unchanged and unchanging, whatever context or whatever viewership it may happen to meet. Maps epitomize what Michel Foucault was getting at when he defined discourse as the medium in which the way we organize our knowledge of the world guides our ability to act upon it. It's not a question of whether the Mercator or the Peters projection is more accurate or truthful as a representation, but what modes of power are made possible by the positions we're invited to take up within each system of representation. Bowling liked what he called the, quote, mobile paint structures that he saw in Jasper Johns' False Start of 1959, which used colour strokes to unhinge the signifiers of line and form from the signifieds they were meant to stand for. But paintings such as his Night Journey of 1969 went further. As colour overflows stenciled outlines demarcating geographical boundaries, and these were made with an epidiascope that he'd borrowed from Larry Rivers, Bowling foregrounds the fluid materiality of paint. As he put it in a 2006 interview, quote, all these bleeds of paint, these marks, they're not predetermined. The paint is pooling and flowing, end quote. And what his matte paintings thereby created was a decentered visual field. The viewer is unfixed from the Euclidean geometry that positions us to accept the map's authority as an objective document of unchangeable truth. For Greenberg, modernist abstraction had the transcendental goal of overcoming all that was extraneous to art's essence. In pursuit of such teleological end purpose, medium specificity meant, quote, each art would be rendered pure, and in its purity find the guarantee of its standards of quality as well as its independence, end quote. But the decolonial space into which Bowling delivered the viewer to question cartography as imperial discourse par excellence was predicated precisely on the hybrid impurity of a painterly process in which the figural and the proto-formless were brought together in combinatorial permutations. Crisscrossing the Atlantic meant Bowling went homeless for some quarter century as far as nation-based art history narratives are concerned. But in a 1976 interview, he acknowledged that such journeying made his insights possible. He said, quote, if I hadn't been in New York, I wouldn't have been able to come to grips with black art. There would have been no way of doing it had I remained in London. And it's through this that I've come away knowing that there is something very distinctively black, as there is something very distinctively Jewish or Scots-Irish, but there is no black art. There is classical or tribal African art, but not black art. Struggling with the either-or logic built into the deep grammar of modernist criticism, Bowling's striking conclusion, quote, I believe that the black soul, if there can be such a thing, belongs in modernism. Black people are a quite new and original people, end quote. This strikingly anticipates Gilroy's thesis that it was the state of unbelonging into which black people were thrown by the Middle Passage that gave rise to counter-modern insights into the very foundations of Western civilization. Today, we can readily see the call and response antiphony by which Middle Passage of 1970 by Frank Bowling dialogues with Turner's Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On of 1840. Both works investigate the materiality of paint so as to address the oceanic sublime that asks whether slavery is visually representable as such. But within the epistemological universe of high modernist discourse, such connections were entirely unseeable, unthinkable, and unsayable. The discourse of modernism that acquired institutional authority in the 1950s spoke in universalist terms because it saw meaning as intrinsic to the artwork. In this internalist view, the meanings accessed by disinterested viewing, that is to say, contemplative looking for its own sake, would stay unchanged by virtue of the work's autonomy. Today, rather than saying that meaning is in the work, in the way that the baked beans are in a can, the tin opener for which being connoisseurial knowledge, we would rather say that meanings are context dependent and that different audiences derive different, even conflicting readings of one and the same artwork, all of which makes the production of meaning something that is multivalent, changeable, and open to reinterpretation. So with Bowling, we essentially have a Janus-like situation, with the words in his formalist grammar holding onto a late modernist mindset, while his actual practice, his art practice, departs towards a relational alternative. Insofar as the rules of discourse pre-exist the subjects who come to voice once they've learned the codes and conventions that allow them to speak, we see in the case of Anwar Shemzar a journey that was cut short by the East-West binaries through which institutional modernism dealt with cultural difference when it faced them head-on. Born in Simla in 1928, Shemzar arrived in London in 1956 with an established reputation as a painter and as the author of 2 novels in Urdu. Shemzar had taken a leading role in the debates on cross-cultural aesthetics undertaken by the Lahore Art Circle and their short-lived journal, Khayal, in 1953. Having studied philosophy, Persian, and Arabic before his first degree at Mayo School of Arts in Lahore between 1944 and 1947, he enrolled at the Slade and chose to start over so as to pursue the calligraphic modernism of abstract paintings such as City Wall of 1959, and in part also because he envisaged returning to Pakistan to make art education central to the nation-building project. After 4 years, during which he exhibited at the New Vision Centre, run by Dennis Bowen from South Africa, who also exhibited Aubrey Williams, and Gallery 1, which was run by Victor Musgrave, who exhibited Francis Newton Sousa, amongst others, Shemzar did return to Pakistan. But finding no institutional position that was agreeable to him, he dejectedly came back to the UK, where he relocated from London to Staffordshire to be near the family of his wife, Mary Taylor. So instead of multiple belonging, Shemzar got stuck in the provinces, where he continued to work productively up to his death in 1985. So what went wrong? Starting over made him feel like a failure. In a 1963 statement, he said that at the Slade, quote, "I met young and very English students trying Englishly not to be English. But within a few months' time, I had failed my drawing test," end quote. Even worse, quote, "One evening, when I was attending a weekly Slade lecture on the history of art, Professor Gombrich came to the chapter on Islamic art, an art which was functional, from his book, The Story of Art," end quote. Shemzar writes that, sitting on a bench afterwards, quote, "As the students came out, I looked at all their faces. They seemed so contented and self-satisfied," end quote. Whereas when he went home, quote, "All evening I destroyed paintings, drawings, everything that could be called art," end quote. So the Coldstream report made life drawing foundational to art education in Britain. But Shemzar found himself in a crux, because whereas the line in Western empirical traditions of detached observation makes itself mimetically subservient to the world of appearances, the calligraphic line in Islam is the holy word itself, which means that in revealed religion, the scribe is not ornamenting a prosaic message, but is subservient to an act of spiritual devotion. It's not that Gombrich was ignorant, but that the commonplace narration of Islamic art as mere ornament and decoration, which made it functional rather than autonomous, was predicated on the view that the essential building blocks of pure form, the sphere, the cube, the pyramid that Plato had in mind when he posited an unchanging realm of ideal forms for which the material world that we access through our senses is but an imperfect copy, was something the West claimed symbolic ownership of ever since the days of the ancient Greeks. Every regime of truth has its constitutive exclusions, for the discursive rules that regulate what gets to count as true mean that whole areas of living experience are cast out as unknowns. For Roger Fry and Clive Bell in the 1920s, tribal artifacts were to be valued for their formal qualities, but for their properties of shape, mass, and volume alone, because the ritual purposes for which African carvings were intended were foreclosed as unrecorded and therefore unknowable. At a time when the new Commonwealth moment was being eclipsed by the American-type painting that was shown at Tate in the 1956 exhibition Modern Art in the United States and in New American Painting in 1959, Shemsa's intricate experiments in pulling the line into a field of transculturation fell below the radar. City Wall of 1960 stacks horizontal blocks that are inspired by Islamic architecture into a vista, almost seems to recede, as suggested by the diminishing size of the scarlet, crimson, green, blue, and grey bands that are made up of the minimal units of squares, semicircles, and double semicircles. But as we see in the wall that's on your left, the flatness of the support surface rhythmically asserts itself by virtue of the interplay between voided space and the scumbled densities of colour that set up a push-pull oscillation, further animated by the open-ended character of the modulated structures, which have a protean shape-shifting life of their own that eludes any finalizing sense of closure. So the line in works such as these calls out to its playmate in Paul Klee's equally small-scaled works, and Shemsa even travelled to Bern to write a book about the Swiss modernist. But nothing came of it, because the British cultural environment, by the early 1960s, fully attuned to the North American axis of influence, was unreceptive to cross-cultural practices that had one foot in the mother country and one foot in the former colony. So Islamic architecture seems to be a source for the lattice-like structures Rashid Areen produced after he switched to art from civil engineering in works such as Neela of 1971. But it is in fact more germane to identify the prefabricated steel girders that he stacked in various permutations, and these were made while he was still working for British Hydrocarbon Chemicals in the mid-1960s. Winning the John Moores Prize in 1969 with a modular sculpture in which serial structures featured divided sides, Areen's steps from minimalism through conceptualism to performance encapsulated the key principles by which these three practices instigated a paradigm shift of Copernican proportions in the critique of institutional modernism. Declaring in 1970 that, quote, handmade art is obsolete, Areen upheld minimalism's decentering of the authorial subject that had been central to the liberal humanist view of art as personal self-expression. Opting for industrial fabrication, minimalist sculpture shifted the interpretive centre of gravity away from the artist's self to the viewer's phenomenological presence as an embodied participant whose activity completes the work. Minimalism encouraged the beholder to become self-aware of the artwork's surrounding environment as it affects and conditions one's perception of forms that cannot be taken in on purely optical terms alone. So undermining the self-sufficiency of the autonomous modernist art object by making meaning dependent on changeable conditions and unpredictable viewership, Areen's chakras highlighted how minimalism's tendency towards theatricality opened art beyond the white cube. Dispersing circular discs into rivers and ponds, the artist relinquished authorial control, allowing chance and accident into an event-based and process-based conception of aesthetic experience. Enacted in London, in Paris, and in Karachi, Chakras had a transnational character of a piece with the back and forth journeys through which Irene wrestled with the early 1970s malaise that he experienced when he grew disillusioned with modernism's self-insulating claims to universality. In a turbulent social climate where anti-immigrant racism became increasingly institutionalized in the UK, he wrote, quote, "I went through a period of intense identity crisis and disillusionment with art activity. I was reading Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. I also read in a newspaper about the death of David Oluwali, caused by the police in Leeds. He was a Nigerian who came to Britain to study engineering, but rejected by and disillusioned with the white society he found himself in, he became a vagrant." So aggregating press clippings and activist flyers in a pinboard-like setting for Oluwali of 1972-73 is an image text piece that upheld the anti-optical thrust of conceptual art, of which Terry Atkinson of Art and Language said, quote, "What conceptual art seems to be doing is questioning the condition that seems to rigidly govern the form of visual art, that visual art remained visual," end quote. But bearing in mind that the identity crisis trope was just that, a discursive trope voiced by the migrant as a question that otherwise remains unspoken in a public sphere where racism is subject to denial and disavowal, we must note that, as well as its critique of the visual, for Oluwali marks the turning point at which black got taken out of the dominant discourse of race and appropriated for a political counter-discourse in which anti-racist alliances among Afro-Caribbean and South Asian communities brought a new identity position into being. After spending 2 months in Pakistan in 1972, Irene became a member of the Black Workers' Movement when he returned to London, joining an organisation that had started life as a chapter of the Black Panther movement, which had been founded by Darcus Howe and Olive Morris in Brixton. So let's pause for a moment on the definition of black. It would not at all surprise me if our counterparts in Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Canadian or Afro-German contexts felt that the black British have dined out on this story once too often. Yes, on the one hand, Afro-Asian black had currency circa 1978 to 1986, and that was a limited time period. But on the other hand, what purely empirical accounts lose sight of when the episode is misread as a local tactic of defensive coalition, what is lost sight of are precisely the analytical tools that Stuart Hall gave us in his 1988 New Ethnicities essay, when he pointed out that, as a collective identity position, the materials black is made out of are discursive through and through. Barbadians and Bangladeshi shares little in common genetically. Hindus and Rastafarians do not observe the same customs, which is to say that the new position was constructed not racially, nor ethnically, but discursively. On 31st July 1977, Irene performed Packy Bastard, portrait of the artist as a black person, at Artists for Democracy. 36 slides showing images of Grunwick strikers and his earlier sculptures rotated on a carousel alongside audio recordings of folk song, film music, and National Front chanting. The artist swept the floor like a menial labourer before sitting blindfolded like a political prisoner, then cutting the broom into pieces before collapsing in exhaustion. To go for a person-centred interpretation is to be captive to a liberal humanist view of art as cathartic self-expression, whereas the title of the piece alone foregrounds identity as a discursive construction. The question being asked is, am I that name? In Hall's view that, quote, identities are the points of temporary attachment to the subject positions which discursive practices construct for us, end quote, we see that detaching from the position of otherness which black signifies in codes that fix its equation to absence, negativity, and lack, does not depend on going to a place outside the discourse, but on appropriating the signifying chain so as to unfix such equivalences and thereby open one's identification to repositioning by rearticulating the elements in an alternative chain of equivalence. From such positioning, Irene took a leading role in establishing the Black Phoenix Journal in 1978 and later Third Text in 1987, as well as curating the Other Story exhibition in 1989, all of which cut an opening into the closure points of an art establishment that could hear questions of cultural difference only when they were encoded in the discourses of primitivism or Orientalism. On account of his romantic attachment to the macho image of the artist as a lone male hero, Rashid painted himself into a corner. But in the bigger picture, Irene's pathway through minimalism, conceptualism, and performance recapitulated the steps Adrian Piper had taken on the other side of the Atlantic in a quest to also break out of modernism's institutionalized endgames. When the Art Workers Coalition, amongst other organizations, called for a public discussion of MoMA's acquisition policy, director Lowry Bates declined. On the day of the boycott, the museum issued a press release in the form of a Q&A. Quote, "In selecting works of art, does the museum consider the sex, nationality, religion, politics, or race of an artist? No." What criteria does the museum apply? Quality, historical significance, significance of the moment, end quote. So talking to itself so as not to talk with others, this monologic speech act nonetheless betrays the dialogical principle whereby every I is dependent on the otherness of the not I around which identity is positioned. Unlike complaint, which passively demands redress for the injury of exclusion, critique, as in institutional critique, understands the transformability of what is being critiqued. So it's not whether MoMA's protesters got their demands met, but that 1968 marks a historical break of epoch-defining proportions whose consequences have taken over a quarter century to come to terms with. Let me put it this way. In 1955, you might have visited Edward Steichen's The Family of Man exhibition, or in 1973, you may have watched Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man on BBC Two. He got a lot of attention, but who was this guy called Man? No one seems to see him around anymore. The Copernican decentering of liberal humanist man was the late 20th century achievement brought about when concepts originating with post-structuralism in France were translated and taken up by post-New Left social movements that made difference the touchstone of contemporary life from the 70s onwards. Claiming an objective voice that could speak for everyone, the universalist position from which liberal humanism sought guarantees for authoritative decisions, such as which art to collect, was a product of 18th century Enlightenment. Yet prior to the critical moment of decentering, the very foundations on which man spoke were buried, hidden out of sight. Just as no one can see the ground on which they stand when they're standing on it, it's the otherness of the other person that we depend on in order to recognize the partialness, the limitedness, the finitude of the place from which we speak in the signifying practices of differentiation that constitute the symbolic order of culture. Quote, "I am interested in the elimination of the discrete form as art object," wrote Adrian Piper in 1971. And in performances where she presented herself as an art object, she theatricalized a breakdown in the visual rules of looking and being looked at, which ordinarily establish identity on the basis of mutual recognition. It's completely understandable that the people she passed by on the way to Macy's to buy gloves and sunglasses would not want to come into contact with sticky wet paint. But in her discrepant embodiment as an unfinished painting, when Piper said of her actions, quote, "I defined the work as the viewer's reaction to it," what Rosemary Meyer's photo documentation reveals as the content of Catalysis 3 is the downcast and averted gaze that avoids eye-to-eye contact which normatively establishes and confirms identity. Piper understood identity as a process phenomenon in which the act of putting forward an appearance is dependent on a second act that responds to it in a two-part interaction. Her unreadable and aberrant appearance as something unassimilably other showed that it is when a version denies recognition that the experience of being rendered invisible as a social nobody who goes unseen is performatively produced by the act of not looking that denies intersubjective reciprocity. She's surrounded by women of colour who are all looking down, not face-to-face eye contact. Putting her philosophical commitments to the test had the outcome of strengthening Piper's allegiance to Kant. And while Robert Storr has argued that, quote, Piper speaks in universals in order to reveal the intrinsic partiality of any claim to that perspective, end quote, her contrarian rejection of post-structuralism serves only to highlight the twists and turns of how we got from the then of the 1970s to where we are 50 years later. So photography was all important in breaking the stranglehold of medium specificity. Used initially in conceptualism to document and record, this naive use of photography was problematized by Victor Bergin, whose image-text disjunctions sought to estrange the viewer. But if simulation strategies involve the clean handling of reprographic techniques so as to further displace the expressive markers of humanist authorship, it's striking to note that in responding to race, as it was thrown onto the national agenda by conflict between police and black youth at Notting Hill Carnival in 1976, Bergin's UK 77 of 1977 contrasts markedly with the dirty words that Gilbert and George inserted into their phototext work as documents of graffiti. To observe messy expressivity in Keith Piper's splatter and drips, in strong colour contrasts, and the emphatic facture of stenciled and graffiti lettering, is not to witness the return of the authorial subject, but to take stock of the urgent need to inscribe cultural difference against the wall of disavowal that was reinforced in the standard leftist view that supported anti-racism, but that saw race itself as a superstructural illusion which covered realities of class. On such a view, black culture was not something worth paying attention to because the blacks should subsume their particular interests into that of the labour movement, whose goals were held to be universalist and all-encompassing. Art and language members taught at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham, where Piper studied for his BA between 1980 and 1983. But it's hardly surprising, given the left's unspoken assumptions, that it was a case of disconnect. In moving back a step to engage pop art concerns with cultural mediation, Most Wanted Persons of 1984 cross-mixes sources of extreme disparity, combines the graphic design template of the Penguin paperback edition of George Jackson's Black Panther Party memoirs with photographic portraits from Leni Riefenstahl's pseudo-ethnographic picture book, People of Cow of 1976. So while humanists decried commodification, Piper examined the mobility whereby cultural materials travel and circulate across routes and channels that open mass-produced imagery to unpredictable appropriations, which escape the control of their author's original intentions. And in South African Colouring Book of 1977, Gavin Jantes had already staked out similar grounds for a post-pop investigation of the migratory agency that images acquire thanks to photomechanical reproducibility. So it was pure happenstance that when Jantes arrived in Hamburg on a scholarship after his graphic design degree at Michaelis School of Art in Cape Town, the British artist Joe Tilson was a visiting lecturer from 1970 to 72. In printmaking terms, there is a degree of overlap between Tilson's pages of 1970, which featured news clippings of global events, and Jantes' quotational collaging from media sources in South Africa. However, Janchi's framing of Ernest Cole's revelatory images from The House of Bondage, published in 1967, established an intertextual framework between photography and printmaking that Janchi's built upon in the two posters he produced under the auspices of Artists for Democracy. These are Freedom Hunters and City Late of 1977, both of which quoted iconic images from the Soweto uprising by the renowned black South African photographers Peter Magubane and Sam Nzima, respectively. South African colouring book was also informed by a politics of pastiche. Shocked at the naivete of his German counterparts, who asked why South Africa's black majority could not simply overthrow the Afrikaner minority who ran the apartheid system, Janchi's pursued pedagogical aims without recourse to didactic self-certainties. With his multiple routes from South Africa through Germany into Britain, where he settled in 1982, Janchi's underscores diaspora as a domain of discontinuous histories. Instead of the model of transmission that sees art education as generational variation within an unbroken continuum, such stop-start lineages mean that writing art history diasporically must attend to the vicissitudes of cultural translation. The students who formed the Black Art Group, BLK, attending various Midlands art schools in their late teens and early 20s, had to parent themselves, so to speak, for the chances of being exposed to African American or Caribbean art history, or seeing exhibitions surveying the work of the Black Arts movement or the Caribbean artists movement simply didn't exist in the UK circa 1982. But in the absence of a visual continuum, literary sources such as the Black Aesthetic Anthology, edited by Addison Gale Jr. in 1971, underwent Black Atlantic translation. A work such as Piper's Black Assassin Saints of 1982 drew on a 1967 text by the African-American playwright Ron Milner, even as its fabric construction hybridized English trade union banners as a concurrent material source. It is all the more uncanny, therefore, to observe the circulation of iconographic tropes, such as the gagged figure bound to a chair in David Hammonds's Injustice case of 1970, which evoked the state that Bobby Seale was put into by Judge Julius Hoffman, who refused him the right to defend himself at his Chicago trial. We notice that the trope returns in both Keith Piper's Reactionary Suicide of 1982 and in Donald Rodney's mixed media installation, The House That Jack Built of 1987, where the seated figure has been hybridized into a tree whose bare branches call to mind strange fruit indeed. The subtitle Self-Portrait, if you can just make it out on the extreme left, the subtitle Self-Portrait among X-rays shaped in the form of a house, which were literally appropriated from Rodney's medical treatment for sickle cell anemia, asks whether the historical violence brought to bear on black bodies can be housed or contained in representation. Yet the affective force of the piece stems not from mimetic depiction, but from the indexical nature of signifiers, the signifiers, X-rays, that are generated from direct corporeal contact, just as Hammonds's body print also sidesteps the pathos and moralism by which the black body in pain is violently reduced to a visual cliché of impotent suffering within prevailing codes and conventions of race and representation. The first National Black Art Convention, organised by Eddie Chambers, Claudette Johnson, Keith Piper, Marlene Smith and Donald Rodney, members of the Black Art Group, in October 1982 at Wolverhampton Polytechnic, was attended by Bowling Arene. But I want to focus on what John Okomfo said, and I do this in part because film, like photography, was integral to the post-medium condition that contemporary art acquired as a result of the institutional critique of modernism. Listening to a tape recorded by Marlene Smith, Okomfo said, quote, "On it you hear me say that I'm not an artist and I don't think we need the phrase, but that what I'm committed to is collective practice and the concept of art as a practice in general," end quote. In the 1970s and 80s, film offered departures from the liberal humanist view that privileged the mediums of painting and sculpture as the authentic expression of authorial selves. We have today an indispensable chronology in Chambers' survey text, Black Artists in British Art. But to omit film and photography is to fall back on conservative methods that inadvertently reinforce the misperception of black visual art practices as a self-contained development separate from everything else, which only needs to be covered in week 10 of a 12-week syllabus. So the struggle to rewrite art history so as to decolonize it from West-centric narratives not only necessitates the work of theory, the necessity of ideas, but filmmakers such as Akomfrah and Isaac Julian were in the forefront of the intellectual ferment that resulted in the 1980s transformation of black cultural theory, which, as it emerged from black British locations, achieved worldwide impact. In early works such as Territories by Isaac Julian and Sankofa Film and Video of 1984 and Handsworth Songs by Black Audio Film Collective of 1986, there is in fact a Mobius loop at play. Filmmakers who were highly knowledgeable about film theory, as debated in the pages of Screen, were translating critical precepts into aesthetic moves at the level of film speed, color tinting, voiceover, and frame-within-a-frame remediation in essay films which were then taken up into transnational and often controversial reception. Salman Rushdie, for one, did not much care for the experimentation. But when Coco Fusco curated Young British and Black in New York, and when Claire Watkins and Mbai Cham held Celebration of Black Cinema in Boston, and when Yvonne Rayner co-curated an event somewhat clumsily entitled Sexism, Colonialism and Misrepresentation, a corrective film series, all of which took place in 1988, such uptake in the United States confirmed the living reality of the circulatory networks by which the Black Atlantic is defined. Likewise, when Kelly Jones curated Ingrid Pollard and Rotimi Fani-Kayode, among others, in the Transatlantic Dialogues exhibition she organized at the Jamaica Art Center in New York in 1989, what was highlighted was the degree to which photography and film, more so than painting and sculpture, alongside neo-conceptual work by Lorna Simpson, Fred Wilson, Glenn Ligon, and Renee Green in the African-American context, all contributed to the irrevocable shift that defines the contemporary in contradistinction to the modern. So diasporas are the spaces into which populations are forcibly scattered and dispersed by involuntary migration. Yet when its subjects elect to make journeys of their own, such dislocation and decentering can provide imminent critique that operates in and against structures of discourse and representation in which social reality is lived. C.L.R. James put it much more succinctly, quote, "Those people who are in Western civilization, who have grown up in it, but yet are not completely apart, made to feel and themselves feeling they are outside, have a unique insight into their society," end quote. And along these lines, I conclude with some questions that ask us to clarify what exactly we want an initiative such as Black Artists and Modernism to achieve. I have invested throughout my work in the principles of collage and montage as an aesthetic that gives us the best fit for lives which are composed of heterogeneous elements from multiple origins. Diaspora identities have themselves been collaged into history by contradictory forces, as Ralph Ellison long ago pointed out with regard to Romare Bearden's photomontage projections. When Sonia Boyce's photo booth self-portrait in From Someone Else's Fear Fantasy to Metamorphosis, a collage of 1987, calls up the fear fantasy formulation that Laura Mulvey employed in the 1970s to investigate the specular construction of the female body, we're in the midst of a genealogy that allows us to see the porous boundary between inside and outside in Talking Presence of 1988 as articulating identity as a composite matter, made up of decomposable and recomposable elements. In the act of bringing two dissimilar elements together to create a third that's utterly unique, as Maud Salter did in her Circus series of 1993, where an August Sander photograph of a black male circus performer in 1920s Germany was an archival starting point for her meditations on Europe and Africa's intimate entanglement. The juxtapositional frisson of differencing, to borrow Griselda Pollock's use of the verb, means that the aesthetics of hybridization parts company with the liberal humanist myth of wholeness. Composite beings who exist in a state of incompletion are, by definition, open to future possibilities of further growth and transformation. It may be that the hybridity concept feels cringeworthy for some, although the debate that ensued from the anti-hybridity backlash of the 1990s, which investigated syncretism, creolization, and mestizaje as preferable terms, productively led to the view that translation and transculturation more adequately help us account for the generative agency of difference in giving rise to the new throughout the modern age. Hybrids are combinatorial propositions. This is to say that the concept of the grotesque, as I applied it to Chris Ofili's work, such as Aphrodisia of 1997, in Mikhail Bakhtin's sense, that the grotesque is a transgressive boundary-crossing practice which decenters the rules of symbolic order, all of which makes it, like the carnivalesque, a long-standing resource in strategies of subversion that operates in cognate terms to the combinatorial logic of the cyborg, for whom saying goodbye to humanism's founding myth of originary wholeness, as Donna Haraway once put it, is the principal driver for Afrofuturist interests in the possibilities of transmutation that give us the ahuman, neo-human, and transhuman that we see collaged into the work of Ellen Gallagher and Mangechi Mutu. So we're all susceptible to the short-term pressures of the hurly-burly that push us to want to be at the front end of the fashion cycle. No one wants to be yesterday's favourite, especially those who know what it's like to be left behind when there is no welcoming place for you in the narratives of belonging that allow individual artists to see themselves in the long-term picture. But just as inclusion lowers the stakes that were once defined as transformation, so I worry that in the era of neoliberal pluralism, where the proliferating abundance of art entails that making decisions about aesthetic value seems to matter less and less, what we face is a resurgent formalist universalism that falls back on the vocabulary of modernism to ratify what's trending in the comings and goings of market success. Thinking of form in the idealist philosophical tradition as something that is essentially and intrinsically resistant to change is understandably appealing to mortals who know very well that their condition of living is vulnerable to changes over which none of us have ultimate control. It thus makes no sense whatsoever to fall back on the false choices that might want to persuade us that the absence of figuration in a work such as Zarina Bimji's Out of Blue, film installation of 2002, or the abstract painting of Julie Miretu, gives us inherent advantages over practices that engage with issues of representational form, whether that's Hervin Anderson's paintings or the installations of the Otolith group, for instance. Whereas modernists saw context as a static backdrop against which the glittering jewel of the autonomous artwork stood out all the more vividly, the concept of conjuncture put forward in cultural studies allows us to get at the conditions of historical contingency, whereby the interventions of black artists have indeed altered and modified the contradictory and highly changeable balance of forces which define the present as open-ended and undecided in its outcomes. Stuart Hall held that, quote, cultural identity is a matter of becoming as well as being. It belongs to the future as much as the past. It is not something that already exists, transcending place, time, history, and culture. Cultural identities come from somewhere, have histories, but like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation, end quote. In light of this, we notice that John Okomfra's Vertigo C of 2015 was rightly celebrated at last year's Venice Biennale. But when reviewers are inclined to tell a "that was then, this is now" narrative, in which the artist is said to have outgrown the particularism of inner-city riots for the universalism of planetary ecology, such simplification fails to understand an important fact. It was precisely as a result of his 30-plus years of journeying through his chosen medium of the moving image that this artist's process of becoming has delivered him into a place from which to return to the Atlantic as an oceanic space of astounding beauty and mortal terror, where the ontological boundaries that ordinarily differentiate the human, the inhuman, and the non-human are all thrown into fluctuation. Quote, "Man is an invention of recent date and perhaps nearing its end," end quote, said Michel Foucault in 1966. Yet his world still had edges that separated land and sea, whereas like the decolonial spaces that Frank Bowling mapped before him, Akomfrah is contributing to the intellectual commons of our contemporaneity by operating from the decentered location of his diasporic experiences as a subject who is in the West, but not quite of it. Instead of the short time it takes to calculate inclusion, whose reward is to assimilate into the status quo ante, paying attention to the slow time of art's historical becoming, the metamorphosis by which irrevocable transformation takes place, often imperceptibly, is to notice that the very question that's animating our conversation has also changed. It's no longer who are we, but rather who or what would we most like to become.
There are a number of things that I would like to kick off with, but really I want to involve everybody in expressing some thoughts and some questions and some areas of discussion, that have been raised by Kobena. So I'm really going to be fielding questions here, but I suppose part of my first response to your abstract, I was struck by the kind of journey from the kind of post-war period to the present, almost the present, in terms of the 1980s into the 1990s, and wondered about a particular essay that had been written by Stuart Hall in around 2005, 2006, where he talks about 3 moments within Black British art history and practice, and what he calls a kind of conjuncture. So he talks about, for instance, the generation of the 1950s, the post-war period, and how those artists had fully embraced a kind of universal idea of modernism, that was basically their reason almost for practicing, was to be engaged with that, and then arriving in Europe and finding a very different kind of reception to their embrace of that idea. Then Stuart Hall then talks about a kind of transitional generation who were kind of quizzical, you might say, of the claims of modernism as a kind of universal proposition. And then he raises the question about the generation that have emerged out of that from the 90s onwards. And I was kind of reminded of this in both your abstract, but also in your paper today. So that was my question, was whether there was an influence at all of Stuart Hall's plotting certain kinds of questions.
Definitely, I relied on it a lot, but I recalibrated the periodization. I'm less concerned with the cohort of the 1990s. I think Yinka Shonibari, Chris Afili, Steve McQueen, David Adjaye, and so on. Historians used to have a 50-year rule that unless it's 50 years in the past, it's journalism. Now, things have speeded up so much in the symbolic economy of culture that we can't wait to put into our historical record what happened last week. But I'm quite confident that that cohort will have their stories told as they should be. So I readjusted the periodization to go into more depth in looking at the way in which the universalist vocabulary of modernist internationalism gave Frank Bowling, Aubrey Williams, Anwar Shemzar a strong sense of entitlement. They came to the metropolis on an egalitarian basis, We are thoroughly schooled in the Bauhaus, in Russian constructivism, in German expressionism, and they were welcomed and treated as equals by Victor Musgrave, by Dennis Bowen, and so on. But it all falls apart in the mid-60s for very many reasons. And it's not a conspiracy of 7 people having a bad day deciding that you're no longer in the top 10. For example, Aubrey Williams goes back to Guyana when it becomes independent in 1966 to take up a commission, and in a sense drops out of the radar of the metropolis, to say nothing of the way that the abstract painting he was doing got displaced by pop and so on in the mid-1960s. So I'm trying to introduce more of the volatile cut and thrust that I think is there in the background to Stuart Hall's piece. And I see the second generation as including, I refer to them as decolonial, but I think transnational also works. So you have someone like Mitra Tabrizian, who's never claimed to be black. That's not her identity. But she's positioned herself in conversation with black British artists. A piece that she did with Andy Golding, such as the Blues Phototext series in 1987, is in keeping with the fear fantasy formulation that was taken up in post-colonial thinking too. So I think that that transnational or decolonial cohort, in my view, is quite different from the third grouping, which were black artists born in Britain. His parents had mostly migrated from the Caribbean, Africa, or the subcontinent. And I think the shift from, you could say it in dichotomous terms, it's a shift from universalism to particularism. But I think their investment in the particularity of black as an identity position had everything to do with their disaffection with the organized left. I think there are many stories still to be told about this very interesting moment in the 1970s when politically this idea that the industrial labor movement is a universal subject that encompasses everyone's interests and will bring about historical transformation, that dissipates. It completely fades away. And we all know who came to claim that ground instead. But culturally, you have very interesting developments like Rock Against Racism. I think it's taking place in the sphere of music, and Isaac Julian's film Young Soul Rebels speaks to this as well, more so than exhibitions you would have seen at the ICA in 1976. But it's in music that you see white Britons also disidentifying from colonial definitions of national identity. And I think that is another part of that transitional moment between the decolonial transnational generation and then the black British generation that come up in the 1980s.
I'm wanting to start to ask people whether they have particular kinds of questions or responses that they'd like to kind of just interject into the conversation that we're having. Are there any particular immediate responses?
This is I'm not sure what I'm asking. You talked about Stuart Hall, the word black and people coming together politically rather than race, where you come from, whether you're Indian or African, but black. But then when you showed the work by David Hammonds and Rodney works of there were transparent X-ray and transparent, I was thinking about the word in that context. I don't know, the word black, because I'm thinking in terms of metaphors of transparency, race and politics. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where that word fixes.
Yeah, I think the principal issue to put in the forefront is what's the materials out of which identity is changed? If identity isn't fixed and it's transformable, what is the material that has to undergo a process of change? And Stuart Hall's argument is that it's discourse. it's not mitochondrial DNA. Scientists can do all sorts of things to induce genetic mutation, but that's not what happened in the anti-racist 70s. Nor is it all a kind of melting pot of we're all sharing the same culture, practicing the same customs. It's thinking about a way in which discourse has the agency to construct the positions from which we speak. So in the performance of 1977, my view is that the question that Rashid Areen, and I think he really carries the onus rather than Donald Rodney or David Hammonds of that post-colonial redefinition of black here. Because the most interesting thing about black in that post-colonial definition is not exclusively Afro. It's really the South Asian contribution to it and the contribution of different Asian diasporas that infuse it, that make it very different from the African-American discursive context. But the key issue, I think, to keep in the forefront is that what is it that has to shift? What is it that undergoes transformation? Is discourse. And this summer I had the privilege, really, of editing and writing up Stuart Hall's 1994 Du Bois lectures. This is the fateful triangle, race, ethnicity, and nation. So Harvard will be publishing that next year. But that really rehearses in depth the consequences, the political upshot of the discursive turn. I mean, that moment of Afro-Asian black is long gone, but it's salutary. It's significant to think about that in terms of writing the art history of the late 20th century, in terms of thinking about the contribution that cultural practices made to bringing about change in the medium of discourse.
I suppose I wanted to ask you also to go a bit further in your discussion about collage, because it seems to me that you are equating discourse with collage somehow, and I don't know if I've got that idea wrong. So I wondered whether you could kind of explain a bit more by what you mean by the kind of cut and mix and the trying to find what the terminology you used was, but there seemed to be something that you were that you're pinning onto this format, this form of collage that seems to speak to that question in a way.
There is. I'm quite invested in it, and invested in it in a way that actually complicates the distinction I was making between the modern and the contemporary. So I think the key quality, the formal principle of collage that excites me is that it's combinatorial. Something that's made up of multiple elements has a temporary unity, but those elements can be taken apart and put back together again. So it seems to me to accompany a relational understanding of identity, which is not the revelation of some true self that was buried by distortion, stereotypes, or mystification, but that you recompose the elements that are already there, the elements of discourse that are already out there in the culture. There are only 26 letters in the alphabet. There's an infinite number of words, utterances that you can produce by combining them. And it's a structuralist rather than post-structuralist principle, but it seems to have got lost in the wash somehow. And I think collage is interesting. I would be interested in a genealogy that would relate someone like Romeo Bearden in the African-American context of the 1960s to Hannah Höch in Germany in the 1920s. I think it's doable. I'm not quite sure why it's not yet been done. I think there are probably some discursive barriers that need to be dismantled in order to see how these artists, a German woman and African-American man, are drawing on the photographic archive. It's not African sculpture that they're dealing with, it's photographs of African sculpture. It's a mediated representation of Africa that they're both engaged with. And in that sense, I think there's a continuity that we've yet to narrate between modernist practices before 1945 and their post-war descendants, as it were. I was emphasizing here what happened when modernism got institutionalized by museums of modern art. But when we talk about multiple modernisms today, for me, the challenge is to think about Afro-modernism as one among many contributing variants that, really from as early as the 1920s onwards, we do see a kind of cut and mix quality. In literature, it's there in Cain, the experimental text that Jean Toomer produced in 1923, the same year as James Joyce's Ulysses. But it's also there in terms of the slightly off-center ways in which African-American modernists like Lois Mailou-Jones are appropriating imagery of Africanity and photographs of the Mangubetu woman, for example. So there is this, this investment in a kind of recombining images of Africa, which in one discourse are reinforcing a primitivist signified, but which can be taken out, can be pulled out of their place in the signifying chain and recombined to produce the new Negro. That's the position from which the new Negro is speaking.
Kobena, picking up on what you just said, which is really exciting, I don't want to collapse writing into discourse, that would be wrong, but I was excited by the fact that a lot of the artists you mentioned were also writers. Is there, simple question, is there something that blackness does to the artist-writer relationship?
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that so many of the artists I was talking about are writers as well. I think there's a commitment to art's intellectual agency, its investigative function. And I think maybe that's an important difference from the 1990s cohort. Maybe it's carried out in other ways. Sorry, I've lost sight of the second part of your question.
I just want to know whether blackness as this transformation of identity had some effect on the idea of that relationship between the artist and the writer. Did it change our view of it?
I think I'd have to think about that one in terms of specific writers, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Carol Phillips, Jean Binter-Breeze. I think that the literary has been very important in terms of that moment from the 70s to the 1980s in bringing different audiences into this debate about redefining blackness and Britishness. So in that sense, there is a departure from that compartmentalization of the visual and literary that was so important to high modernism, that wanted to eliminate, just get rid of anything that smacked of the literary. And I see that also in the African-American context as well. I think it's not only there in image text practices, Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, and so on, but there's a productive relationship between the visual and the literary in terms of like a shared repertoire of concepts as well.
I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the I guess the effect that these artists would have had on the kind of mainstream discourses that they inhabited at that time, because I suppose you've talked about their lineage and their journey as artists from elsewhere, but what was the legacy of their practices within the kind of mainstream British discourses around art history? So talking about it from the other perspective, maybe you could.
Well, there wasn't one. There wasn't one. I mean, in a patriarchy, we're conditioned to think about lineage in terms of descent. It's the father's property that gets descended to the son. That's the normative narrative that many art histories are still loyal to. Whereas if we begin with diaspora, we have a discontinuous rhythm, a stop-start rhythm. Some people don't like that because it doesn't fit into your narratives in which abstract expressionism begat colour field, which begat, and so on. Some people are still very enthusiastic about those linear stories. They're very loyal to them. But the challenge in thinking about rewriting art history is that that method is not value neutral. It's not something that you can just transfer to diaspora artists or artists who are operating from a position of multiple belonging, multiple attachments. And so I think that's part of the exciting creative intellectual challenge, and that to face it, we need to move away from that reactive position of pointing out what's been left out, what's been excluded, and move towards a much more proactive position that can draw on Henry Louis Gates, that can draw on Stuart Hall, all the amazing intellectual resources we have, to think about entanglement. You know, it's not so much that there were black artists influencing Gilbert and George and Victor Bergin, but they were artists who were engaged with blackness as a signifier in the 1970s. So let's move away from this sort of family tree narrative, this heteronormative narrative of looking for the father, and think more about the more promiscuous way in which elements circulate and how they hybridize. I think that's the challenge, really.
Thank you, Kobena, for a wonderful lecture. Following on what we've just been dealing with here is one thing that wasn't raised this evening in the lecture was class in terms of modernism and, you know, the culture of imperialism, Eurocentrism, and I wonder sometimes how far we can actually leave this out of the agenda of the conversation or the discourse that you're talking about, because there were a lot of historic factual developments within modernism which were profoundly based on a Eurocentric class system in relation to the other and the displacement that came about from that. I mean, how do you, I'm just curious as to how you grappled with that yourself, or if you have something to say on that.
Well, I did say something about it. It was the clunky nature of class reductionism in the 1970s that meant the left failed to create alliances that could have had profound outcomes. It's the failure of the left that I was speaking to, which explains the shape we're in terms of a conjuncture being a balance of forces. It's the failure of the left to offer an alternative to what was being put forward in nationalist and racist terms that has brought us to the sorry state we are in now. So that was something that I did speak to and has to be integral to any understanding of how the last 3 decades of the 20th century shaped up. But which is also to say that what you get in cultural Marxism that I don't think you get in cultural criticism, art criticism, that operates from the basis of liberal pluralism, is a quest to think about the whole. I think what's worth paying attention to in the Marxist tradition is that they always directing our attention to looking at the contradictions that each present moment is attempting to overcome. In many ways, multiculturalism as an ideology is attempting to overcome the problems being created by deregulation and globalization as it's practiced under neoliberalism. So I think there's still a lot, it's important to be proximate, to be in conversation. I wouldn't identify myself as a Marxist, but I pay attention to what Marxists are saying. So I think whether it's Frederick Jameson or Benjamin Buchloh or an art historian like Terry Smith, I think there is value to be had. And I think I agree with you that it's essential for there to be a conversation. But yeah, it's essential for there to be a conversation in order to understand how these different elements get articulated, how they get combined. What's the combinatorial glue that, that makes political economy part and parcel of problems of political economy, part and parcel of the contemporary moment.
So I was just about to say that I know that we've had a lot to think about, and we've got several conversations to be had over the next coming days. I'm hoping everybody here will be joining us over at Tate Britain in the Claw Auditorium to continue these conversations and these dialogues that have begun tonight. I want to thank Kobena for what I think was quite an epic journey. And I'm hoping that the questions that you might have, that you might bring them to the conference tomorrow, because I know that he's quite exhausted now, and I think that I think we need to give him a chance to also assemble what the responses have been, but there's more chance tomorrow and on Saturday to really start to, for us all to be grappling with some of these questions and to put forward some of those questions. And I'm sorry to cut this evening at this moment, but I do think that, one, we are going to be thrown out of the building. So I want to thank you all. I mean, it's just been an extraordinary show of interest and conversations to come. So thank you so much for this evening, and we continue tomorrow.